Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the launch of an important and timely work, Beyond Expropriation Without Compensation, Law, Land Reform, and the Future of Redistributive Justice in South Africa. The book launch is part of the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign monthly online dialogue series on mapping out to the next food system. Last month's dialogue was on closing the loop. It was exploring food sovereignty and zero waste. And next month, the focus will be on toxicity, biodiversity loss, and the industrial food system. Today, we are dealing with the land question. There can be no food sovereignty without transformative land reform. And in this thought-provoking book, legal scholars, land experts, and critical social scientists embark on an in-depth exploration of one of the most critical and contentious issues facing our nation today, which is land reform. With a keen legal eye and a profound understanding of social justice and the worsening climate crisis, the authors navigate the complexities of expropriation without compensation, unpacking the legal framework, political motivation, social implications, and arguing for transformative approaches. As South Africa continues to grapple with the legacies of its past, this book offers a nuanced and comprehensive analysis of how we can move forward in pursuit of equitable land redistribution. Professor Ruth and Professor Vishwas Satgar will speak to their chapter contributions in the book. Professor Hall holds the South African Research Chair in Poverty, Land Reform, and Agrarian Studies, and is the acting director of the Institute for Poverty, Land Reform, and Agrarian Studies, known as PLAAS, at the University of the Western Cape. Professor Vishwas Satgar is the editor of the Democratic Marxism series, principal investigator of Emancipatory Future Studies, and the co-founder of the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign and the Climate Justice Charter Movement. They will each speak for 20 minutes on their chapter contribution, and then we will open up the webinar for discussion. Professor Ruth Hall will go first, and then Professor Satgar will go second. Professor Hall, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Charles, and hello to everyone. I've recognized some names in the participant list, and I'm sorry we're not hearing each other, but maybe later during the discussion that can be addressed. It's really great to be here. Thank you, Charles, for the introduction. Thank you, Vishwas. Thanks to the Food Sovereignty Campaign and the Climate Justice Coalition for this opportunity. I'm having this experience of talking into, a void, but I'm going to make some assumptions about who's here, and I may be wrong. I think there's probably a mix of people, maybe some students, maybe some activists, people who are primarily concerned with land rights and land issues, but also a lot of people who might be concerned with social movement, mobilization more generally, housing matters, food rights, and so on. So those are sort of some of my assumptions. I wanted to start by sharing an anecdote. Recently, I was at a conference in Colombia focused on land grabbing, and by this we meant corporate land grabbing around the world and the process of commodification that is continuing around the world. It's always useful to get that corrective, to not think that South Africa is the only place that is dealing with questions of land inequality and land injustice. And in Colombia, we went on a field trip, and one of the sites that we visited was a large hacienda, a big commercial farm that had been expropriated without compensation. And this followed the 2016 peace agreement in Colombia, after which the property, which was considered the proceeds of crime, including the property of the big narco bosses, the big drug dealers of Colombia, was confiscated and has been redistributed partly to demobilized peasant guerrillas, to indigenous people who've been part of this military conflict. And so there was this large commercial farm that had been expropriated without compensation, and we met with the cooperative that was setting up their organization, their land use, thinking about how to organize themselves in the land. And what was so striking for me, coming from a South African context and having done a lot of research on farms that have been redistributed or restored through land reform, was that their starting point being on the land with actually quite insecure, unclear rights, without much support, in an environment that was mostly hostile to their vision of what they wanted to create. Their starting point was not that very different from land reform projects in South Africa. And I tell this because I think that it helps us to focus on not just what is the mechanism of how to get the land, but for what is a process of redistribution and reform. Who is it for? How is it going to be taken forward? So that's a digression. The book that we're talking about today was based on a conference, and the conference and the book has a lot of law in it. In fact, a lot of the conference was consisted of presentations by lawyers. Vish and I were among the outliers. And I'm not a lawyer, but I learned a lot in the process. Firstly, perhaps it clarified why some of my best friends are lawyers, but also why I'm very relieved that I'm not one. So a great deal of the discussion at the conference and what you see in the book, by the way, it's an open access book. And I like the way it's arranged because you can download the whole book or you can go chapter by chapter and just get the PDF of the chapter that you want. So a lot of the book is about ideas of property, about value. How does one value land, about compensation? And some of it, frankly, is probably somewhat technical and will appeal more to lawyers, but not all of it. And I actually found some of the lawyers' arguments quite accessible. Some of the important debates, just as background, were about, for instance, can you challenge the idea of compensation and market compensation in the courts? And the one important example there is from 2016 when Tembeka Nkatobi was an acting judge on the Land Claims Court. And he said, no, these people in KZN are labor tenants. They have a right to this land, and we will not compensate the landowner as if they have the right to all of the land, because there's a land right here, which is by somebody who is not the holder of the title deed. And the travesty of that case is that after he declared that, the property owners took it on appeal to the Supreme Court of Appeal, and the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform supported the property owner against the claimants. And by the way, at that time, President Zuma was in power and Minister Nkwinti was the minister. So, you know, I think that that's an important corrective if we're wanting to think about the politics of this issue, not just the discourse and narrative of expropriation without compensation, but what's the actual politics in terms of how the state has used its power. So there were different views in the conference about the questions of compensation. Does it require a constitutional amendment? What do we even mean by expropriation without compensation? And is that actually the most crucial issue when it comes to dealing with land injustice? So my paper sort of took less of a legal perspective, although I did refer to the Constitution. And what I tried to do in this paper, which drew on both the recent debates around expropriation without compensation, but also went back to the 90s when I was a postgraduate student. And I was following the land debates because I was writing about land policy in 95 and 96. So what I tried to do in my paper was to say, expropriation without compensation is so much a catchphrase that means sort of everything to everybody. But its particular power is because it signals this radical change, but it's fundamentally ambiguous. It's unclear about exactly what the agenda is. And what I tried to do in the paper was to say, well, if we were to go beyond that framing of expropriation without compensation and think about what is actually the agenda for land justice, then maybe we should be thinking about a phrase that's already in the Constitution and which hasn't really been fully exploited. And that is the phrase equitable access to land, which is in section 25.5 of the Constitution. And I'll talk a bit about that. So firstly, just in terms of summarizing and talking about how the debates in the period from 2018 onwards, when the EFF made this proposal in Parliament, the ANC amended it, watered it down, put on some constraints like there can't be expropriation without compensation if it threatens national food security and so on. So, I talked through and I've just summarized some of those debates because it was quite a complicated process where there was a constitutional review committee, hundreds of thousands of people wrote submissions, hundreds of thousands of people went to public hearings. So in many ways, it was like a form of political theater. I almost characterize it as like a kind of a public referendum on how people feel about injustice, not just around land, the physical land, but about injustice in the structure of the economy and our inability to deal with structural inequality that is entrenched from a colonial past. And so a lot of the responses to this debate in the public hearings were from Black South Africans saying, change the constitution, do away with a property clause, we want expropriation without compensation, while the majority of the written submissions, much of which were organized by property rights groups, banks, farmer associations, etc., were saying, leave property rights. We need the constitution to defend private property. And in all of this, it seemed to me that there was a false distinction being set up, as if the constitution is saying that there cannot be radical transformation of land, and as if there are those who are wanting to defend the status quo, are wanting to keep the constitution, and those challenging it wanted to do away with the constitution. And I think that this is a particular way in which kind of neoliberal political discourse was feeding into some quite populist ideas that were, on the one hand, very state-centric, and on the other hand, actually willfully ignoring the real politics of land on the ground. So, what I felt has happened is that this two-stage process that Parliament adopted, which was opening up the floodgates to debate, do people feel that there should be a change in the constitution? Should there be expropriation without compensation? And the overwhelming response was yes. And even though Parliament actually ultimately said, we understand it's not necessary to change the constitution to allow for this, it already is allowed for. Nonetheless, there should be a change in the constitution. And then there was a long process, which was much quieter behind closed doors, about how to change the particular wording. And this served a very real political purpose. Firstly, it took Ramaphosa through the 2019 elections, and it helped him to consolidate his power in the party. And secondly, it just deferred the question around this and converted it from a political demand into a technical question. And I recognize also that by participating in some of these processes, including in the presidential panel, that despite saying quite consistent things in that process, that even my presence there was part of a political ploy in many respects. But what I characterize the ANC position during this time as being is that it was navigating a line, and that line was both inside its own party, or Ramaphosa within the party and its diverse factions, but also more broadly in society. And I characterize it as a talk EFF, walk DA kind of position. And that is how it effectively survived the process, while actually having a very, very extensive process that yielded absolutely nothing. But going back to, and I know that Charles may be messaging me already to tell me that timing is probably moving along. But I felt that what needed to be said about this debate is that the question of whether or not a particular property should be compensated for or not is, or that there should be nationalization of all land, the state should hold all land, is the idea that there's one solution to all the diverse situations in the country. Thanks, Charles. I'm glad to hear that I have 10 minutes. And again, we hear the discourse, which is that, the answer to land inequality is that the state should hold all the land, or in the case of the MK party manifesto, that the state should be nationalized and held in custodianship for the people by the state and traditional authorities, which is the unclearest formulation I can imagine, that it'll be ownership will vest in the people to be held by the state and or traditional authorities, and in an unclear way. So the problem, I think, that with the framing of expropriation without compensation, my concern with it is not that questions around the justice of compensation, but rather the assumption that there is one solution to everything. And that what it does is that it sets up, in a sense, a false binary between, on the one hand, the defenders of private property and a discourse which vests all faith in a state or a state plus traditional leaders who are going to be benevolent in some way. And I think that there are problems from a political point of view. There are profound problems with both sets of assumptions. So what I did was thought it's useful to actually think back to and interrogate the process that led to this constitution. There's a very powerful framing of the property debate in South Africa that says the ANC sold out in the 1990s at CODESA, and it basically sold the demand for land reform down the river by agreeing to property rights. So I thought that it's worth going back to those debates. And what I did is I drew on some of my thesis work. I did an honors, master's, and PhD around land politics in South Africa. And I sort of told a bit of the story about how the ANC, which was always ambivalent, by the way, about nationalization, had long abandoned the idea, even by the late 80s, long before CODESA, and then confirmed its position even by 1992 in its land manifesto. And by the time the Constitutional Assembly was happening in 95, it was definitely private capital, big banks, mines that were pushing that there should be a property clause. But the property clause they wanted was one that would say those who have property cannot have it taken away from them, right? And that is what the interim constitution did, the 93. But by the time it got to the 95 into 96, there was a very powerful movement within progressive forces that said, if we are going to have a property clause, it cannot be a property clause that will insulate existing regimes of property. It has to actually be a mandate for transformation. And that's the phrase that I've tried to popularize through this paper and elsewhere, is that if we think about the property clause as a mandate for transformation, it actually forces the state to redistribute, to restore land, to do tenure reform, to override private property rights. And it says that nothing, there's a clause, if you actually go one by one, you'll see there's a clause 25.8, says that nothing in this section can impede the state from taking all measures that it needs to bring about redress and justice. So, and the particular framing of the one clause that I think is the most underutilized is section 25.5. And there, I think one of the drafters was Jeff Budlander. And he explained in an early draft paper where he explained how, caucuses of people were trying to think, if there's going to be a property clause, how can we make sure that instead of insulating property, it says it puts obligations on the state and it strengthens the hand of the state to override private interests in the interests of reform. So this idea of section 25.5 was born, which was, the idea was that there would be property rights for the propertyless. In other words, rather than the property clause saying property owners have rights, it would say that those who are dispossessed, who are landless, have a claim against the state, and the state has to respond to them. So this was, a framing that has been lost over time. In fact, the state has chosen to never have embark on any kind of law that would say what is the nature of that right and how can people claim from the state. So what I was trying to do here was to say that if, in fact, the state says, well, we can't move because of the Constitution. That the extent to which the state is saying that landowners can basically slow down land reform, landowners have a veto, it tells us about the politics of the state. And the idea of access to land on an equitable basis, this section 25.5, doesn't say which land. It can be urban land, it can be rural land, but it says the state must take reasonable legislative and other measures to enable citizens to gain access to land on an equitable basis. Equitable having very clear legal implications. Equity means that there should be priority given to those who have greatest need, and there should be equity. In other words, we should be moving towards greater equality over time. In my view, the state's land reform program falls foul of this requirement. It hasn't. We can carry on dishing out farms here and there to people, but we're not actually advancing equity as required in the Constitution. So those might be technical matters, but what I want to mention here is that I think that after so many years of many civil society, social movements sort of hammering on the door of the state in various ways, and this whole explosion of public demand about expropriation without compensation. If I were to read the moment that we're in now, it's one in which things do move along, and things don't move along because they're moving in Parliament. In fact, far from a parliamentary process defining this issue, we're not going to find the solutions to our land politics in the Constitution, but we're very likely going to be finding it on the streets, in the areas where people have occupied buildings, on the farms where people are fighting against evictions, in the rural villages where they're very mobilized movements who are facing mining companies colluding with government authorities, colluding with traditional authorities and others. So this is the politics on the ground, where people are demanding justice and equity. And they're not all demanding that the state have unfettered power. So the problem with expropriation without compensation, in short, is that it focuses on the supposed world in which the state is desperately trying to acquire property, to embark on redistribution, and has a plan for that, but is held back. I think that's not the world in which we live. So what I've tried to do is to provide a lot of this as background to thinking about, if we're to move beyond the idea that the state expropriating from private owners is the answer. The question is, how do people, Abashlali talks about we are doing expropriation without compensation. That is happening on the ground. It's not waiting for the state. In fact, the state is very unlikely to side with those who are taking action. But very importantly, this is not all about a single land question. The expropriation without compensation is happening also for those communities who are faced by mining companies. They are being expropriated without compensation. So I think that refocusing on the question of how people organize around a demand for land, whether that's access to land for small-scale farming in and around cities, whether it's access to land because farm workers are facing eviction, why can't portions of farms be expropriated, and why can't they settle on the land that they already are on, right? So I think that reimagining a set of possibilities around land justice, in which we say the Constitution was a mandate for transformation. The state has chosen not to use it to a very large degree. How is society planning to take forward these concepts of land justice? So I'm sure I should be finishing up. Thanks very much, Charles. Thanks, everyone. I look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Ruth, for those powerful insights. I like what you said at the end, that the Constitution was a mandate for transformation. And thank you so much for your powerful insights. Vish, over to you.
I'm going to use PowerPoint. As Ruth said, it was quite a learning experience, sitting with all these lawyers and so on, and thinking through property relations and the Constitution, etc. But my chapter is one of those disruptive chapters that tries to place the agrarian and land question on new ground and to actually shake up things from a slightly different perspective than, say, the EFF. So my chapter is titled Ecological Justice, Climate Shocks, and the Challenge of Re-Agrarianizing South Africa Through the Food Sovereignty Commons. So we cannot think about the land distribution question in isolation from the histories that we've been through, of violence, dispossession, abuse, etc., and see land in isolation from the natural commons that forms the basis of the society we live in. The two dominant approaches that we've had, sort of market-led and state-centric approaches to land reform, or calling for state-centric approaches to land reform, in their kind of argument, they are not transformative and they do not lead to ecological justice. And basically, I mean, the kind of idea that comes through is that we're just going to make black farmers like white farmers. They're going to be commercial, industrial, globalized farmers. And so this chapter asks the question, is this really transformation? This chapter also wrestles with an ecological justice approach to land reform based on the kind of ideological orientation of the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign. And we have a very inclusive notion of ecological justice, which embraces climate and social justice. So this chapter also recognizes that, while we have to address the legacies of dispossession and the injustice, we also got to realize that we are facing a sort of looming nightmare and the kind of climate crisis and risk factor that's hitting us all. So it's about trying to think land and to rethink agrarian change and more generally the food system from that perspective. In other words, a climate justice perspective. The other thrust around this contribution is to argue that there is a third approach to a state-led or a market-centric approach. And that is to think about land and the food system as part of a food sovereignty commons or a commoning approach. And this is grounded in an articulation of a politics around democratic systemic reforms. In other words, it's based in an understanding that people have to lead this process of transformation. And at the same time, we've got to have a systems understanding of what we are tackling here. And of course, these are reforms in the sense that they bring power to bear. And these reforms can be weak, they can be strong, or they can be truly transformative, depending on the aggregation of power that drives this. But in the main, the way the Food Sovereignty Campaign understands this is claiming our constitutional right to food and water, ecological justice, and eco-ethics grounding this politics. So this chapter speaks to 4 issues, which I'm going to touch on very quickly. The first is a critique of globalized industrial agriculture's ecologies and how it's imbricated in the general crisis of socio-ecological reproduction. Now, this is all building on my work on climate famines, and the first talk we gave in this seminar series was about that. The second theme that I will draw on is placing the commons in the making of South African capitalism and historiography, and to really think about the history of capitalism and farming from a slightly different perspective, a commons perspective. And then, of course, highlighting the dangerous ecological rifts of globalized industrial agriculture. In other words, the case for why we need to break with the system and kind of thinking about it as a deep, just transition challenge. And then finally, the challenge of re-agrarianizing South Africa through the food sovereignty commons, its normative, systemic, and agential practices. So just very quickly, and I think most of you in this audience would be familiar with the fact that agricultural systems are extremely vulnerable in the context of climate risks and shocks. Various studies, which I reference in my paper, talk about this. Globalized food systems particularly have numerous vulnerabilities in the context of a heating world. COVID-19 revealed a lot of those vulnerabilities and weaknesses as well. Between 2021 and 2022, we had a synchronized shock on the globalized food system, exacerbated by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and sort of a multi-dimensional shock. Now, when economists speak about it, it sounds as though, well, you know what, the system is just adjusting and absorbing this. But the fact of the matter, those who are hungry experience this as a collapse of the food system. We've had various shocks like this, circa 2006, 2008, 2009, 2011, in our region in 2014 with the El Nino, and of course, the huge oil spike in 2018. What the climate issue does is force us to rethink famine. And I allude to some of it in this chapter. Firstly, you know, famine is thought about as food deprivation. You don't have food, and eventually, you know, the sequence and logic is that leads to hunger and then mortality. But I think if we think this notion of famine in the context of a 1 degree Celsius increase in planetary temperature, the risk of famine really goes up. What I call climate famines in my work. Now, Madagascar in 2021 was the first country to have a climate famine. There was just one driver of this famine, and it was a heavy drought that hit Madagascar. And basically about 1 million people were impacted. We never talk about this. We are not aware of it, etc. But this is now, if you like, a growing dynamic and trend. So climate famine, in a sense, upends how we think about famines and the literature of famines, the conceptualization of famines, and it does this in 3 ways. The simultaneous shocks, climate shocks that hit societies bring down food systems, and we saw that in Madagascar, for instance. But it also sometimes combines with other dynamics like war, and that's what's happening. It has happened in Ethiopia and the Tigray region, but also in Sudan currently, where millions of people are facing starvation. They had a drought, and on top of that, they have military conflict. The other thing about climate famine thinking is that it's all about climate apartheid. I mean, the global south, the more we experience climate shocks and our food systems collapse and we have climate famines, this is about climate apartheid, basically, where the global north is not tackling this problem, is not bringing down its emissions, it's not providing the resources, etc. And therefore, we are bearing the brunt of it. The third thing about climate famines is that it's symptomatic of the larger crisis of capitalist civilization and its ecologies. The second theme that I draw on from food sovereignty thinking is placing the commons in the making of South African capitalism and historiography. So what are the lessons we can draw from the past, a sort of decolonial perspective? So the commons concept, you know, it's not a blueprint, but there are some very basic aspects to it. Commonwealth of life-enabling systems, so our water, our land, etc. It's governed by a community of commoners, and lives are reproduced and the system thrives. Now, in this chapter, I use the concept of the commons mode of production as a heuristic to basically think about the human-nature relationship from 200,000 years. And basically, that's what existed, the commons mode of production. And it was there up to the end of feudalism in the global north, and it was there up to the colonial encounter in the global south. South Africa's historical sequence then changes in terms of its history. So we have this commons mode of production. We then have militarized mercantile capitalism and then settler capitalism. This is what happens in terms of our transition dynamics, and this is how we end up with capitalist agriculture. So using this concept, I attempt to kind of rethink the historiography, and there's 3 quick points to make from a decolonial perspective. The one is that we really got to have a richer understanding of the commons mode of production. Right now, our historiography is very cursory, but yet there's so much to learn about the first diets that humans had in this commons mode of production, indigenous eco-ethics, spiritualities, etc. The second point to make is about learning historical lessons for the present, for adaptation, subsistence, and survival. Again, this is not romanticizing the past, but trying to learn from this decolonial archive for taking the commons to a new level. So drought-resistant foods, botanical knowledge, restoring customary land, and so on. And then, of course, this concept helps us think about the genealogies of oppression in a much broader frame. So the liberal and Marxist historical accounts of South Africa and its making, in my view, are very limited. So race, class, gender, fine. Important. But what it occludes is ecological relations. And so the commons mode of production idea prompts us to think about the Dutch wave of expropriation and dispossession, the British wave, the Afrikaner wave, and even the African nationalist wave of dispossessing the commons mode of production. The other theme in this chapter is around just thinking about the ecological rifts of the current industrial agricultural system. Because again, if we don't have this front and center, you come back to what I started off with, transformation for the kind of EFF or the ANC will be let's have a class of black commercial industrial farmers. But there's something wrong with this food system. It's premised on super exploitation of humans and non-humans, and I have data in here about the wages that farm workers earn, which is appalling. But also just depletion of our soils. I mean, the depletion rate of our soils in South Africa is shocking. Okay, our water as well, and its extraction and appropriation links to this history of colonial conquest, apartheid, etc. There's unequal ecological exchange as well that happens. So yes, we export a lot of our seafood, a lot of our fruit, etc. But we're not just exporting a commodity. We are exporting our nutrients in our soil. We are exporting water. We are exporting the pollination functions of other little creatures, etc. And so if you really value all of that, there's something irrational about globalized industrial food systems. Biodiversity loss is imbricated in this food system. Species extinction has happened through this food system and is continuing to happen, including bees. This food system poisons ecosystems, our riverine systems, our oceans, etc., with its chemicals, its fertilizers, etc. Carbon emissions as well. It's a major source of carbon emissions, and it is part of, if you like, what I call the climate crisis trap in this chapter. The multilateral negotiations hasn't really dealt with the food system problem in any serious way. In South Africa, the data we have, the inventory we have, I think there are some methodological issues around it, around how it measures and quantifies this. But nonetheless, it's implicated in the climate crisis trap. Hunger, in the making of this food system, particularly under colonialism, and I allude to some of the literature on this and examples and instances, very heartbreaking stuff of famines that emerged in the beginning of the 20th century in South Africa. We'll never know how many people died, particularly African people, from these famines because there weren't records kept and so on. But this same system and this logic, this ecocidal logic of it continues into the present. Did you know that while millions are food insecure in this country, 89% of our maize production and 7% of our soybean production goes into feed for livestock? So again, a very serious irrationality in the system. So these ecological rifts of the existing food system make the case for its fundamental transformation, root and branch, at a systemic level. We cannot go into the world that we are going into with this current food system. We have to break with it. We have to transform it. So this is where the alternative of re-agrarianizing South Africa through the food sovereignty commons comes in. So food sovereignty is a counter-hegemonic concept articulated by La Via Campesina. It's critique, it's systemic alternative, and it's about a movement. Now, various actors have been translating this concept in the South African context, but the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign, I would argue, has gone the furthest. It comes out of a dialogue in 2014 across all provinces, a food conference, and it's engaged in pathway building in communities, villages, towns, and cities, and I allude to some of this work in my chapter. But it also developed a People's Food Sovereignty Act during the drought when our food system collapsed. And this came out of 3 food sovereignty festivals, research, a people's parliament, etc. And essentially, all of this praxis embodies, if you like, a much broader conception of justice beyond liberal conceptions of justice and constitutionalism. It treats humans and non-humans as legal subjects. It affirms the positive freedoms in our constitution. And of course, the need to think about legal subjectivity in terms of collectives. And again, the thrust of food sovereignty is to argue that just replacing white farmers with black commercial farmers is not transformative. We need a commons approach to land and climate justice. And this again is grounded also in an ethics of care rather than a politics of hatred. And that's what grounds even the food sovereignty campaign. from women who have been starving and who've given testimony at our hunger tribunals and so on. Their ethics of care comes through in how we understand the food sovereignty. As a democratic systemic reform, as I said, it's how we get there. It's a strategic, it's a political category and concept to get us there. At the heart of the Food Sovereignty Act is the idea of democratic planning. And basically, it's about a triple transition of our food system, the mono-industrial system, small-scale producers and micro-producers and households, informal traders, and of course, the ocean commons and coastal communities, etc. But what I argue for in this chapter is that with climate shocks, and we saw this during the drought, commercial industrial farmers also took a big hit. And basically, many of them buckled, many of them were bankrupted, etc. And as we go further into a heating world, this is going to become a very serious challenge, even for them. And so the argument in this chapter is that we need to provide subsidies through the People's Food Sovereignty Act framework to commercial farmers to bring them into this triple transition. But these subsidies need to be conditional. They need to rehabilitate the land, which has been damaged by chemicals and fertilizers. They need to embrace agroecology and permaculture and regenerative systems. They need to ensure decarbonization of all farming processes. They need to participate in this democratic planning process and to think about, and with society, how to deconcentrate their farms. And then lastly, to ensure that they do develop a plan around deconcentration. And so this is the kind of, I would say, the nub of the argument vis-a-vis the national debate. There is another way forward for redistributive land justice. We need a paradigm shift away from state-centric and market-centric approaches. We need a food sovereignty commons approach driven by democratic systemic reforms and the triple transition of the food system. We need to claim the right to food in the Constitution, advancing ecological justice and an ethics of care as we do this. And of course, this proposition challenges the state and commercial agriculture to think and act like commoners. We can all have a place in the next food system that can limit climate risk and ensure land justice. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for your input and for bringing in so many key themes. I'm sure we are all excited to engage with both yourself and Ruth for all the exciting inputs that you have both put together. So I will. The chat is open. You can type your question in the chat. You can also raise your hand and you will be allowed to speak so that you can make a comment or you can pose a question to Ruth. Ruth, if I may go first, you argued that Section 25.5 has not been interpreted legislatively or judiciously. If you can just expand on that, and also on how does Section 25.5 of the South African Constitution address equitable access to land, and what mechanisms does it propose to ensure that these goals are achieved?
Thanks so much, Charles, and I'd love to jump in on a couple of comments in the chat as well. So, you know, in the early 1990s, amidst all of these negotiations, the National Party decided to embark on a land reform, right? So the Department of, it was then Regional and Land Affairs, started its own land reform program. And they said, we're going to find typically Black men who look like they have some capital and experience, and we're going to give them subsidies, and they can go off and they can buy state land from us. Okay, so the National Party started doing this stuff, and they passed a law called Act 126 of 1993, and it was and it basically says the minister can use money from the fiscus to go and buy land and to provide it to people, and can also use that money to give them support. This is still the same law that we are using now, right? This is the law. Act 126 of 1993. It's been amended now and then. But the point about it is that it was conceived as a way of government justifying we can spend public money on private people, right? And not everyone, not like a social grant where you have a system that says how you must distribute the resources from the state. It can be dished out by the minister's decision, right? So there's this discretion at the level of a minister to decide, I'm going to spend this much money on this farm, I'm going to give it to you. I'm going to spend this much on this support and give it to them, and so on. So we have this highly discretionary system where the minister decides. And yet alongside that, we have a law, we have the Constitution that says everyone is entitled to access land on an equitable basis. It doesn't mean everybody is entitled to own land. It means that to the extent that the state has available resources, it has to provide those resources, whether it's land or money or support of whatever kind, on an equitable basis. What does equity mean? Well, you know, there are other kinds. This 25.5 was not tested in the courts at the time that we had the conference that this book is made up, emerges from. But since then, there have been several cases. So there was the Tafelberg case that Ndifuno Kwazi took. That actually did invoke Section 25.5. It says, how can you have the city of Cape Town selling well-located land when you have a policy that says people must have well-located land for inclusive housing? There was LRC took a case that I was involved in a bit in the Northern Cape, saying the department bought a farm and settled the farm workers, and then when they didn't use it the way that the state wanted it, evicted them and gave it to somebody else through no due process. How is that equitable? So there actually have been a few court cases in the past few years where people are like, but this isn't fair, right? We can't just ask for the government to have more power, more money, without interrogating how it's using those. So I actually think it's a really important thing. And when we had the high-level panel, the Motlanthe panel, there was a proposal that there should be a law that says, what is this right of equitable access? And if a citizen can say, I don't have a home, I don't have land to be on, wherever I go, I'm technically illegal, you know, because I'd have no recognized legal rights. So then we started to talk about how can we take some principles from the Brazilian constitution, which says that land is not just a commodity. It must have social utility. It must be used in a way that is to the benefit of society. So in that constitution, it actually partly decriminalizes land occupations by saying that if people occupy land openly for a period of 5 years, not for private accumulation, but for their own reproduction, then that is legalized. So we started to think about that. And so a group of people actually wrote a draft law, and it's actually attached to the Motlanthe panel as an indication of how that could work. For instance, at a local government level, when you're doing IDP planning, can people not say and put on the table, here are our land rights in the area? So I want to use that to respond also to the question that Sizwe raised in the I think it was Sizwe raised in the chat, which was yeah, exactly, not waiting for the state, but surely doing things on the ground. So I think that a lot of social movements are doing precisely this, making local plans. Some years ago, we at PLAAS worked with TCOE, and also with the Maibuya Land Rights Forum. And we actually worked around a methodology for working with people in the winelands area, where you have migrants, you have evicted farm workers, you have municipal commonage land, there's big farms being transacted, but there's also public and private land that's not being used in various ways. And we actually said, well, let's start with mapping, you know, rather than waiting for a policy change or the state at another level to change how it behaves. Let's start with a local process, which is looking at what are the land needs and the land demands, and not just land for itself, but for what, and what problems is it meant to address, and for whom, and all those questions that you listed in the chat. So we start to think of like, and this is very important, I think, because it is a corrective to what we've had up to now, which is like a market-based land reform, but also a very state-centric and bureaucratic land reform, such as there is. In my view, we don't really have a land reform anymore. It's basically been stopped. It's dismantled. There's no money for it. It's not happening. But so an alternative is a sort of a movement-based, peoples-based land reform that is integrated with very clear material conditions and needs at a local level. So I think that perhaps in addition to thinking about, yes, this is not about Yoliswa, this is not about ignoring the state and like, oh, just struggle on the ground. But I think there's a strategic question about how strategic litigation here and there, and maybe research, maybe campaigns and so on, move across these different scales. I think that that's where the debate is at now. And I think it's very powerful if you can have, if there can be synergies between specific movements. But I think that almost a peoples-based local alternative land reform plans that are about actually not just changing who owns private property or even who occupies what land, but how does this relate to spatial justice, to ecological justice, to food justice? So I think that that's where I see the debate as being right now. And I wanted to add also, just in terms of the thinking globally, you know, there's this rapid process of the expansion of not just farming, but of commercial farming in parts of the world, including across this continent. And so these models of large-scale, privately held property that are part of industrial food systems is being rolled out, including with support by the African Development Bank and others. And so Vish was referring to the concept of food sovereignty and its relevance. But that brings us to, you know, the next stage of the international campaign, which is there can't be food sovereignty unless you have land sovereignty. And land sovereignty isn't all about redistributing private ownership in individual ways, but it's actually about changing how territories are governed. And so I think that, again, this question about can we think of specific places and not just think about them, there are struggles on the ground. How do some of the organizations that people here are part of already interact with those? And how do we think strategically about alliances for moving beyond the local struggles and linking these things up at more of a national level? And interestingly, last thought, I know we must move to Vish, but I wanted to say that you might be interested also in some of the other papers in the book that focused not so much only on the land thing, but brought us back to how in the 90s, the question about land was so much wound up with questions of economic justice. And there was a big push towards a wealth tax. And that was then taken off the table. It came back in 2015. And so there's a big argument for some people about how economic justice, that we can't expect land and the redistribution of land to be the only, to carry all the weight of dealing with economic inequality, as well as social grants and so on. Questions around different systems of wealth taxation are important. So perhaps we can think about this question of land as being this intersection between quite different questions of, on the one hand, economic justice dealing with inequality, but also questions around access and control of a territory and transforming food systems.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Vish, if you can come in and please also touch on the issue of a wealth taxation, because I think it's one of the issues that you mentioned in your chapters.
Yeah, I mean, but I just want to talk about the Scala question and the scale at which we start advancing this alternative. And I agree fully with Ruth. I mean, the bottom up is key. And so, you know, in my chapter, I allude to some of the pathway building work. I mean, at my university, and many people even in participating in this webinar, Janet and others, we've all been working in communities to try and build pathways and to kind of build localized food sovereignty alliances and hubs and so on. At WITS, we feed 1,000 students a day. It's a serious thing. We have 6 agroecology gardens. We used to have a once-a-month farmers market, which we're renewing now, and so on and so on. So I think that's one level of scale, if you like. But I think with the People's Food Sovereignty Act, which we are currently revisiting, and we've just had 3 dialogues. We're planning to have one in the Eastern Cape early July. We'll have an online assembly in July to present the revised version for final consultation. And then on October 16th, we are calling for a national day of action where we're going to be taking the revised People's Food Sovereignty Act of 2024 to Parliament. So that's the other scale at which we've got to engage. We took it to Parliament in 2018 and they ignored us. We took it to 6 government departments and they ignored us. And again, I mean, you know, the risks are growing. The risks are getting bigger and bigger. The next drought is going to be worse. If they listened to us then, you know, we could have done so much to handle COVID differently, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the scales at which we work are very, very important. And I think that comes out in this conversation. But the bottom up is the key. The other point I just want to make is, I think it was Sizwe asking about, or he made a comment about ownership and culture and tradition. So, you know, state-centric approaches or market-centric approaches, they completely ignore that, they occlude that, they eviscerate that. That's invisible. Whereas a commons approach is actually a decolonial approach. And it takes us back to our history, to our past, to our cultures, because that is central to the kind of food system we need to build. We need to rebuild the indigenous archive around food systems, around knowledge, etc. But we also have to bring back indigenous ecologies. So, you know, commonage land right now is not managed properly. Okay, we need, from the standpoint of food sovereignty work, to go in there and transform that land so that it is a shining example of, you know, regenerative agriculture and so on and so on. But we draw on indigenous knowledge, we draw on indigenous archives to restore those ecosystems, etc., etc. So I think there's so much exciting about a commons approach that converges with ecological justice, that converges with a decolonial approach, and that converges with, if you like, deep transformation of the food system. In that context, you know, the wealth tax issue for me, you know, if you set up the People's Food Sovereignty Act, you know, obviously through debate and so on, but you pass it. Let's assume, as a thought experiment, you pass this law in Parliament. What is provided for in there is also a food sovereignty fund. And this could be part of a renewal of reconciliation in our country, where big business and so on can be taxed through a wealth tax to say, listen, this money is going into this food sovereignty fund so that we can address the historical injustices. And that's another way in which you can resource this process. And again, confronting that past, because the fact of the matter is, for the past 3 decades, we have not confronted this past, and it's haunting us. Thanks.
Thank you, Vish. Janet, you have your hand up. You can please unmute.
Hi, everybody. So firstly, thanks so much. I thought both of your inputs were really helpful. I want to just ask Ruth, can you comment on the issue of the Communal Land Rights Act and what to do about communal land, the former homelands, which are still under traditional authorities? And I also want to relate that to another very interesting and quite contentious point, which is the issue of the Khoisan Traditional Leadership Amendment Act, by which people who claim to have Khoi or San or some combination heritage can claim rights, which includes position and money and access to land and so on. And how does that complicate things? You think about the current politics of the Patriotic Alliance and these kinds of parties. So that's the one question. And for Vish, the issue more about urban land and commons. So I really do like your approach of like bottom up claiming, etc. And I had one of my classes, I had an input from somebody about the MST, and they described how people went onto this farm and just occupied it and took over it. And my class were completely befuddled by this. Like, they just could not imagine, like, how do you actually do this? And you know, I've got to say, you know, we do have to work within the law, and the municipalities have to try and provide services for people and so on. And there are a lot of crooks out there. So if you think like in Gauteng or whatever, you know, these guys go around, they say, we own this land, we're going to sell off plots for development and allow people to build their houses here and this kind of thing. I mean, it's chaos which crooks can take advantage of. So it's just a caution about this idea of like bottom-up people claiming unused land and so on. I mean, I like this idea of mapping, of people engaging, identifying land, which is state land, which is not used, which is suitable, negotiating. I mean, do you remember Sanko had a program like this in about 2000, where they did a whole series of land occupations and then they negotiated for services to be provided and that kind of thing. Anyway, I think it's a really interesting idea.
Thank you, Janet. Vish, you may go first.
Yeah, no. So Janet, actually, you and I are on the same page, and maybe the nuance was lost. So I'm arguing a movement-centered approach to what we do on the ground. So not a free-for-all, not a populist thing. So, you know, if you look at the MST, and I have looked at them, and I've been to Brazil, like many others, to study them, and I've met some of their key leaders as well. I mean, they're a movement that's been around for decades, and they've grounded their politics. I mean, before you take over land, from what I've learned from them, there's a lot of planning and a lot of preparation. There's a whole process of consciousness building, etc., solidarities, etc. So even when you're on that land, you also have to use those solidarities to sustain that, etc. So for me, the movement-centered approach is very, very important. And that means you've got to build capabilities, you've got to build capacities, you've got to be learning from practice all the time. So we're 10 years old as a food sovereignty campaign. We're not mass-based. We've just been doing loose convergence work. But over the next few years, we've just got a good grant, and we're going to scale it up. And we're going to scale it up by building a member-based movement. And I think this is very, very important. And a movement that's strategic. So we'll be having activist schools. We'll continue doing our action research like we've done, learning from practice, and going down this path, showing examples of where this works, showing examples of where the challenges are, and so on and so on and so on. And I think that's the approach I'm arguing for. Thanks.
Thanks, Vish. Ruth?
Thanks. So Janet is asking about, you know, the politics around so-called communal areas, which are not all communal. There are different forms of property and rights that people have within areas, often called communal areas. But, you know, so the one part of there are actually several important parts of the property clause that are neglected. So section 25(9) is the one that actually said, quite apart from everything else, Parliament has to pass a law that deals with and provides certainty around the rights of people who live in the former Bantustans. And actually, so in 96, when the Constitution was passed, an interim act was passed, the IPILRA, the Interim Protection of Informal Land Rights Act, that was just meant to be a one-year holding mechanism while Parliament got ready to pass this law. And it's been renewed annually since then. And one of the reasons is that essentially, politically, and my reading of it is politically, the state of the ANC and government has not been able to resolve the constitutional obligations and its own political imperatives. So it has tried to pass legislation on numerous occasions, and once did in 2004, it passed the Communal Land Rights Act, that effectively had this vision of parceling up large areas, well, all of the land of the former Bantustans, and transferring pockets of them in private ownership into traditional councils, so that it would effectively privatize, but the traditional councils would become the title holders. And then, of course, the question of what rights people have within those areas would be governed by traditional councils. So That was challenged, took 6 years, and then struck down. And we're still in a process where there's been a communal land tenure bill. There's been a communal land tenure policy, and all of these drafts have tried to frame rights in such a way that there are rights for individuals and households, but also they are subject to a hierarchy of authority and governance up to the level of traditional councils. And we know that across the country, traditional councils were meant to become somewhat democratized. There was meant to be representation of people who get elected, a certain number, but many of them, and most of them, in fact, are not complying with that. So, I think that around the question of traditional authority and the importance of traditional leaders as a political bloc was always crucial, and now perhaps more so than ever, because now we have the MK party really posing a threat to the ANC, and not only in KZN but elsewhere potentially as well, on a traditionalist kind of ticket. And here again, I mean, this is precisely what Mahmoud Mamdani has talked about in the ways in which colonial and indeed post-colonial states have manipulated custom, is by converting systems of identity and affiliation where people identify as part of a community and work with certain chiefs and traditional authorities, headmen and others. When that system of voluntary and flexible identity becomes fixed, and it does so through the state appointing and recognizing official traditional leaders who become salaried and who get the perks and become accountable to the state, not to the people. And this is precisely the contradiction in the Traditional and Khoisan Leadership Act, which said that in the case of Black people living in the former Bantustans, just by virtue of being in a place, you are subject to this particular traditional authority. Whereas for Khoisan people who were dispossessed in different ways at different times, and where there isn't as clear a geographic territory, that people can choose whether or not they affiliate. And this is the problem, because it doesn't clarify how those who claim to be the legitimate traditional leaders of Khoisan people are to become recognized. So that is a fundamental contradiction. Last thought about this is that one of the questions you had, Janet, I think, was like, in what ways does this idea of commons challenge us to think of a different kind of solution? And in my thinking, if we think about an alternative which is not about transferring privatized, commodified land. In other words, there's this nationalist discourse which is fundamentally about claiming that. And it's about a redistribution. It's a nationalist, and it's fundamentally a racial question. Then I think that equitable access, read in a broader sense of transforming how people hold land, is very important. It reminds me of Andile Mwitama. At some point, I think when he was with the EFF, maybe before that, was asked, but I think that it was some sort of commercial farmer or somebody who was having a vociferous debate, was saying, but what are you going to do if you get this land you talk about? And Andile's response is, it's none of your business. I want to sit on my big farm and go out in the morning and have a look at my farm, and I don't have to use it. I don't have. So he was basically saying, my nationalist demand for the entitlement of land is one based on historical theft, and that is it. And so that view, which I think is a very powerful one in society, is one in which we don't need to rethink land and its function in society. And I think that that's importantly why it's important to bear in mind that there is a lot of what sounds like quite radical thinking about how to get the land that is actually not translated into radical reimagining of what the land is for. And I think that's what the conversation today helps us to do. Thanks, Vish.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ruth and Vish. Before I go to Lucas, there's a question in the chat from Matthew. And he's asking about the connection between ecological and social equity in the context of the climate crisis, and whether it provides an opportunity to fundamentally rethink and transform how land is used as well as its relationship. If both of you can please touch on that. Ruth, you can go first.
I realized that actually my last comment was, in fact, my response to you, Matthew. It wasn't Janet, and it was saying yes. I mean, if we're rethinking, as you say now. Sorry, I'm on a phone, so that is quite tricky. Yeah, ecological and social equity absolutely have to reimagine land use and land relations. So you know what the term, and I think it was actually Jeremy Cronin who used this term, was representative redistribution. And I think what we've seen is 30 years of half-hearted, state-centric and market-dependent representative redistribution of individual farm plots from white or corporate owners to individual Black owners or small groups or bigger groups or whatever. But this is somehow meant to represent a wider justice. And it doesn't, and it hasn't. And so I think that this reimagining of land and social relations from both a social equity and ecological equity approach is precisely about going beyond the nationalized, beyond the nationalist kind of discourse, and beyond the privatized, commodified vision of transformation.
Thank you so much, Ruth. I'm so passionate about the question Matthew is asking about. I'm even repeating it. Please feel free if you want to come in, or I can.
No. I mean, Matthew knows that, you know, he's been part of the process at Stellenbosch. I mean, okay, there were limits there, you know, where they tried to build the food commons and so on, but it's happening, and I think part of our challenge actually is to unearth more of this. We saw so much beneath the surface during COVID-19, you know, local provisioning and communities governing, etc., which is really what the Commons is all about. I'll be putting out a call, Matthews and colleagues, in this conversation around the theme of the Commons in the everyday. There'll be a conference next year on the Commons in the everyday. This year's conference is on food as commons. Next year's will be on the Commons in the everyday. And we'll be inviting people to write short stories of commoning practices, wherever they are, you know, whether it's carpooling, whether it's, you know, sharing a borehole, things like that. So we're going to try and generate those stories and again, enrich this transformative imaginary. And we'll select from that for a conference on the Commons in the everyday next year. Maybe I should just add the third conference will be on sort of rethinking conservation from a commons perspective. That'll be in 2026. And again, we want to go beyond kind of fortress conservation. We really want to rethink the boundaries between, you know, society and nature, rethink decolonial sort of ways of relating to nature, ethics, and things like that. So there's a lot more that's going to come around enriching how we think the commons in this politics. Maybe I'll add this, Charles. We have a lazy left in South Africa, actually. They stuck in a state-centric imaginary, you know. So the state must do everything. You just mention the word nationalization and the media will classify you as left. But really, you know, a failing state handing over a whole set of things for it to do, to run society, to manage our farming system, etc., is just a recipe for disaster. And so this thing about the commons and transformative politics, for me, is a new frontier. It's new ground that we really have to take seriously if you left.
Thanks, Fish. Lucas, you can come in and make your question or raise your point. Please unmute.
Okay. Good afternoon, all. I hope you can hear me. There's something that's popped up on my screen. I just have to, it's gone. Yeah. I want to just say that I think there's something that we need to consider in the context of what Vish is saying in a movement building concept with regards to state property, that can be released, should be released for the building of not just apartments and housing, but in a movement space to look at how within the commons notion of developing those land parcels for accommodation for residential purposes. Because we here in this part of the country are still governed by a left behind of apartheid state, where so many land parcels exist either by the municipality, by the province, and still by national, whether it's rail yards that are underused, unused, whether it's sporting facilities that is being leased on 100-year leases for golfing. We in our peninsula in the Cape have something like 15 golf courses. Now that can't still not be undone. That has to be addressed. We have 4 or 5 very large defense force parcels of land. You could have mixed use of those lands for commoning, for people having social use of those kind of spaces. And I think the idea of a campaign, a movement-based type of activity is what would bring these parcels of land into the public domain, into the public conversation, because that is what has to happen. It can't be justified that you have all these state parcels of land, whether at the municipal level, provincial level, or even at the national level, not being used for social value. Something has to be done to bring that into the public domain for people to realize that we can address certain social needs. It's how we do it, and with who do we do it, and how do we bring people into the conversation to add value, social value in this context, not only for property purpose value. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Comrade David, for that comment. Comrade Ruth and Vish, do you want to respond to David?
Okay, I think he's on the mark. Sorry, Ruth. And I agree with him. I mean, I think this is what we're trying to do with our food sovereignty pathway building work. And maybe the work you're also doing in the Cape. I see there's a comment here from Matthew around the commons. I think this is it. In our local spaces, in our neighborhoods, in our communities, the household gardening spaces, the communal spaces that we have in our communities for small-scale farming, micro-farming, etc. This is the kind of stuff we have to kind of intervene on around building local food sovereignty common systems. And this land that you're mentioning, I think, again, if we build the alliances, we build the hubs and the processes, there's a logic to that. Where in the end, communities are controlling their food systems. And so, whatever land is unused and so on, that gets taken over. I saw this in Detroit, by the way. I did a study tour there to Detroit. Mazibuko was with me, Ruth. And it was quite inspiring to see what was happening in Detroit, actually, and how they turned a decaying and declining urban metropolis into this amazing regenerative space. And food sovereignty commoning was at the center of that. I'll make one final point, is that I think as we experience more climate shocks and our food systems get disrupted and food prices go up, etc., the issue of localizing embedded food commoning alternatives is going to become the obvious answer. We saw it during COVID, and it's going to become more and more, if you like, a necessity.
Thank you, Vish. Ruth, you may come in.
So there's this a very powerful narrative in South Africa, which is that you cannot mess with the large-scale commercial farming sector because it would threaten national food security. Okay, it's a very powerful narrative, and it gets deployed and rolled out predictably every time there is a push for something quite transformative. And I think that I actually think that the division of the land question into being a rural agrarian one, in which the solution must be farming and farming only, full-time farming, and the urban land question into one of housing, is a very dangerous one. It's also premised on all kinds of assumptions that come from, you know, a past where perhaps there was an imaginary of, you know, an agrarian transition of people from the countryside coming to the city and having, you know, full-time employment and the social wage, and, you know, and being able to live like that. And I think that breaking apart that and showing the importance of land for its diverse functions, especially in the urban and peri-urban space, is very powerful. And that's why I really, Bevel, I really think that the campaign to identify well-located land, because the one thing about land that's important is where it is, right? Location, location, location. So, for instance, the golf courses in Cape Town that have always been on public land and form as a buffer between white and black, between group areas, basically, and still do. The combination of the spatial apartheid, the underutilization, the elite use, the perversion of public interest, and the use of that land is absolutely the right pickings. And I think that, yes, one wants to build things quietly, and I hear you, Vish, about that. But I also think that, you know, yes, commoning is happening, food commoning is happening, people are occupying, people are using land, all kinds of creative, amazing things are happening, often at a micro scale. But I really think that there's a very powerful role for the big symbolic stuff, and for targeting and showing the social utility of changed land uses and the redistribution of land, whether it's public or private, to uses that are more inclusive, that break down the spatial barrier, that enable elite uses of land to be converted into public interest. And you know, the strategies of many of these movements have been working around this. But I think that what Bevel mentions, like which land, a few people have said, like, which land, where, like, exactly. And I think what I've heard of many years is people have said, we need to know who owns what land in South Africa. And that is actually profoundly a question about transparency and being able to understand the source of this inequality. But it's always been reinterpreted by the state as being, we need a land audit. And the answer of that land audit is always the percentage of privately owned land that is held by white versus black people. That's how it's interpreted. But I actually think the demand for a land audit is a far more far-reaching and important demand, which is that if people were to embark on the kind of participatory action, research, mobilization that we've been talking about at local areas, and do a transect walk. What about when you do a transect walk and you want to walk across a landscape where some people have been evicted, some people are squatting on the side of the road, but they have a vision of what they want. Maybe they have livestock, nowhere to graze them. And just walking across landscapes and being able to know who is owning this and who has what rights to this land that, in our view, is underutilized. How can we even dream of democratic or democratized kinds of local conversations around land unless we have that? So that's where I feel that, given the politics of where we are at the moment, I do think that the answers need to come from local levels. But I think that it may not all need to be consensual, you know, and there are points of necessary friction in order to achieve also some symbolic kinds of changes that show the importance of redistributing land in more imaginative, meaningful ways.
Thank you, Ruth. There's a line from Rashida. Rashida, please unmute.
Good afternoon, everyone. So nice to see you again. welcome. And I just wanted to give my 2 cents on land for informal trade. You know, municipalities, local government identifies certain land spaces for us as informal traders. Now, firstly, informal traders are people who cannot find formal employment, and they are not prepared to sit at home and, you know, commit crime in that. So they go out there and they eke out the survival. They are on these spaces, but they're on these spaces with such draconian bylaws, which is, you know, monitoring them. One would swear that an informal trader is committing crime. They are being, the city is now putting watchdogs out there. They are called compliant officers. And they walk up and down to see if you are on your site. If you have not put your family member there to help you, you're not allowed to do that. The permit doesn't give you permission to put any specific person there to assist you. And if you get older and you want to hand over to your family member or your assistant that's been trading alongside you for 15 years, we have that case right now, and they refuse, they will revoke that bay and take it back, and that young person who's been trading there, who now has an opportunity, will be unemployed and on the poverty line. So yes, it's how local government, you know, perceive or dictates the terms of how informal traders are trading on the ground. And these are also things that we want to set right, because as open public land, we are utilizing it for food security. We are utilizing it to feed our families, to earn a living, and to offer maybe a job or two to someone else. But we really become victims of the system, and many traders are so despondent already, but we're never giving up. We know that you are there also as our comrades and allies, that we will push for, you know, the management of these local pieces of land that we currently are trading upon for decades, you know. Thank you very much just for giving me that opportunity.
Thank you so much, Comrade Rashida. And thank you for your fight for over the years for informal traders. And indeed, we stand with you in solidarity. Vish, and then Comrade Ruth, please.
Just to reinforce Comrade Rashida's points. So Comrade Rashida, I'm hoping you're going to be at the 17th of July Assembly, where we will share the redrafted People's Food Sovereignty Act, will still be a draft, and you take it to the informal traders as well. And when we march on October 16th, you were there with us when we went to Parliament with the Fire Brigade. We'd love to see you again on October 16th when we march to the Metro government in Cape Town, and we march to our Parliament as well. So, you know, hand in hand. But just to also say, you know, I mentioned Detroit, but there's some interesting examples also in Spain, in Barcelona, and so on, where the left that's come into office has experimented with a lot of commons approaches, have set up platforms for commoning, and has channeled resources for commoning, etc., etc. And this is where, you know, trading and all of that comes together at a local scale. The problem in South Africa is there's two dominant paradigms. It's either the state, and a failing state in most instances, or a policing state, or the market. And we've got to upend that. We've got to upend that. And again, hopefully, and I agree with Ruth, I mean, hopefully left forces, as they occupy more spaces, even in local government, we start opening up these other ways of provisioning and living.
Thank you so much, Vish. Ruth, if you want to add.
Sorry, it's terrible being on the phone. Now I know which Rashida it is. You know, and I want to say a few years ago, we were asked to organize an event on entrepreneurship. That was the university asked PLAAS. So we thought, what about entrepreneurship? So we thought, informal traders. That's what, the informal sector and women working in the informal sector. This is, so there, again, there's the sort of the terminology of entrepreneurship is deployed as part of a sort of the market will solve problems, and simultaneously informal traders are policed and restricted. So I hear you, and I think this is precisely the point: is that informal traders need and use space, land in cities in ways that help to open up and broaden out and democratize the food system, and that has a crucial social function. And yet, because the nature of that land use doesn't conform to a certain notion of what the food system should look like, and because of the types of access to land are not privatized, commodified property rights, then this function is ignored, both is sort of vilified, both legally and economically, and often the value of it for the people directly involved in the wider society is under-recognized. But I think that these struggles are all going on, and I think that in the same way that the connection between sort of overcoming this division of the urban versus the rural land questions, and also the land questions for housing, for small scale, for trade, etc., that a lot of those links, like even the concept of access to land on an equitable basis, what would it look like? And I think that having that debate, and for citizens, for people to give content to that concept, to say, actually, access to land in a way that is equitable would look like this in our community, in our town, in our rural area, etc. This is what equity actually means. And from there, there are struggles on the ground. There are fights to be won, maybe in the courts, yes. In fact, Dikram Moseneke said a few years ago, there were all these fights to get this clause into the Constitution. And yet, while there have been all these other numerous court battles over other issues related to land, there's actually never been a constitutional court challenge that says, you know what, we have a right of access to land on an equitable basis, and the state has violated that right systematically. And when it had opportunities to realize this right, it has not done so. So I think that, I'm not a great believer that all the answers are going to come from the courts, but it was interesting for me to be in this conversation in the conference and in the book, which is, recognizing that lawyers actually do have a lot of really crucial insights, but it's really in the articulation that the important stuff matters. And so many people were emphasizing that a lot of mobilization, social movements, these things are happening, and sometimes very powerfully connected across sites. And yet somehow the land question, when it gets invoked, is so easily captured in such an unimaginative, small and unproductive way in this binary. So I think, and as I said earlier, the push in the debates, I think in the past few years, have really confirmed that an expropriation without compensation as the magic bullet, and sort of having the statist or sort of patriarchal traditionalist kind of interpretation of what that is, versus a neoliberal one. These are not worlds that one wants to choose between. So it's about giving content to how we can imagine equity and building it across spaces.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Yes, Vish?
I just want to respond to Naren because I think his comment is on the mark, just about solidarity, but also the commons public partnership. And him and I spoke about this in Cape Town recently at a book launch. That's exactly what the People's Food Sovereignty Act is. It's a commons public partnership, or a public commons partnership. Again, we try to bend the stick towards people's power around the food system. This is very different from the hegemonic idea of public-private partnerships. The private sector will lead everything, will lead society, etc., etc. So at our conference in October, actually the paper I'll be writing will be on the People's Food Sovereignty Act as a commons public partnership, because this is where we need to go, to bring in these rationalities from below, to impact on multiple scales of transformation, yes, and in solidarity.
Thank you so much, Fish, for that. Advocate Ngoitobi has argued that the rhetoric around expropriation without compensation leads into what he calls constitutional nihilism, this constant blame on the constitution. And I would argue that it's resulting in a frontal attack on the constitution. I mean, some parties have spoken about tearing up the constitution. So I just like to get both of you, your responses on how should civil society come together to protect the constitution, to ensure that we realize what you referred to, Vish, as these democratic systemic reforms. And how do we ensure that the debate around land reform is not used as a frontal attack on the constitution, is not used to create constitutional nihilism, but that there's an understanding that the constitution in and of itself is not a stumbling block to transformative land reform. And I'm asking this question specifically in the context of the current politics that we are in, having entered a phase or a period of coalition politics at a national level. Not sure who wants to go first, but Ruth can go first. All right.
It's such a hard question. I shouldn't have unmuted. But you know, populism and authoritarian forms of populism and neoliberalism are not as far apart as they appear, you know. And I think that if we're to think about the current moment that we're in and the kind of political spectrum and the impossibility in many respects of defining what is left and what is right, and the ways in which what sound like very progressive and leftist elements of economic policy are twinned with profoundly reactionary and conservative politics in other spheres, then we find that our traditional notions of left and right have no merit. But I think that perhaps this expropriation without compensation debate from 2018 onwards, while it opened up a lot of discussion, a necessary discussion in my view, about injustice and structural injustice, by specifying the single cause or the single sort of symbolic epicenter of it, deflected from the real politics. And those who call for expropriation without compensation or nationalization or custodianship are not supportive of movements on the ground in many cases. So I think that you know, the way in which our political spectrum is evolving over time means that a phase of thoughtful politics in which a push for meaningful structural reform and change of the nature of our economy and society is not a knee-jerk defense of the Constitution as it stands. I think, you know, the Constitution is a document. It was produced at a particular point in time. But either the defense of it, the rigid defense of it, or the rigid vilification of it are both unproductive. And I think that this conversation that we're having is about trying to expand that different path that is not falling into either sort of a defense of the Constitution and everything that it represents, but a defense of democracy, you know. And if there are institutions in our politics that are profoundly undemocratic, then let's debate them. But to negate the Constitution and the courts and the everything, you know, that is another matter. But I think that we really need to be thinking about the neoliberal and the authoritarian and the populist and the fundamentally racist and xenophobic and chauvinist politics that's taken root now as really being a challenge for progressive forces. to not be in defense of the status quo while critiquing those movements. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Ruth. And, you know, like her, I don't see the Constitution as a stumbling block. Actually, it has major transformative potentials. And that's what we're trying to do with our campaigning work around food sovereignty. I mean, spinning off this act, this People's Food Sovereignty Act from below, is testing the transformative potentials in the Constitution. There isn't a law around our food system and Section 27 and so on related to food. And, you know, there's been a lot of debates around the food security law here and things like that. And, you know, techno-fictions around fortifying food so you have nutrition and blah, blah, blah. We occupy that space, I think. And that's what we try to do with the People's Food Sovereignty Act, is take it in a transformative direction. So yes, we want Section 27, but we wanted to validate a much more transformative approach to the food system and land and water. And what's coming through for the 2024 Act is going to be even more innovative and I would say even more transformative in terms of the triple transition of the food system, you know, as I've spoken about it. So that's the one thing. And I think as long as we amplify this politics, we build this politics in society, we give it a mass sort of character, then I think we can handle this sort of extreme right articulations around land and so on. I mean, Mazibuko makes the point in his work, you know, we don't have motive forces around land and the agrarian transformation, and he's absolutely correct. And I think this is what we're trying to do, and we're trying to walk on both an urban and a rural leg, thinking through the system, the food system in its totality. Long way to go, big challenges, but this intellectual intervention, all the grassroots work many of us are involved in, all adds up to another way forward for the country.
Thank you so much, Fish. Unfortunately, I think because of network connections, Comrade Ruth has fallen off. But there were no other hands, and I think we have responded to all the comments and the questions in the chat. So I want to thank our panelist, Professor Ruth Hall, for making the time, for sharing her insights with us. Thank you, Professor Satgar, as well. The book is available, open access. We have shared it in the chat. We'll also share the link again when we send the recording. The recording is going to be available on our OPEC YouTube channel. Please follow our channel for all the other SAFSC webinars that we have had on this monthly online dialogue series of trying to imagine the next food system. Our next dialogue is going to be next month, and we'll be dealing with toxicity, biodiversity loss, and the industrial food system. If you're not part of the SAFSC communication list or the Google group, please drop me an email. I will add you so that you can receive our communication and the resources that we share. So thank you so much for making the time to be with us. Thank you for such a lively discussion. Thanks again to our panelists. We really appreciate you. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye, comrades.
Thank you.
Thanks, Charles.